The Leggy 100 has been a must-read for years. The 2020 version just published this weekend, and now we're talking to the man behind it all, ESPN.com's Jeff Legwold.
What's happening, Phil?
Leggy, thank you for taking some time to join us this morning. First of all, I want to know, how did you come up with the idea to do a top 100 list versus a mock draft like everyone else does?
You know, Phil, I've done mock drafts in the past. That's kind of, a draft staple. But I've always looked at the players, evaluated the players. I learned a lot of football early in my career from scouts. So that's kind of always been how I've looked at football, is how do you find good players, for your team? And, then I kind of learned the strategic X's and O's through the years, but that's kind of backward. A lot of people learn the game X's and O's on up. I learned the game from the players out. Scouts, C.O. Bricado, Blake Bedingfield, a longtime friend of mine, just longtime scouts really sort of taught me the game, and that's how I learned it. So I've evaluated players myself for 33 years probably, and then the top 100's probably been a 20-some year, at least published. I've always done one. I have binders going back to 1987. So, but they've been published for about the last 20, 25 years or so.
What's your process like? I mean, you have so many relationships throughout the NFL. How do you come up with your top 100 list?
Phil, I don't fool people. I'm one guy in my dining room, everyone, trying to look at all these players. Teams have a whole staff of scouts, and they've got, I have to track down video on my own. People have been good enough to help me in the league through the years. But I got to track a lot of that stuff down on my own. And that's why I usually start in September. And then, when the Broncos are on the road, I usually go meet with people when I'm in those cities, who I know, area scouts or whatever, and just kind of grind through the year and then really hit it hard after the season's over.
Do you ever go back and crack open any of those old binders to see how you did?
Oh, yeah, I know how I did. Yeah. You remember the screw-ups the most, probably. And, I go back every year to see, did I have some bias? Did I make bad assumptions in any place? So I always go back year to year and say, okay, why did I have this player here? And then, honestly, you really can't grade it until a guy's rookie contracts are over, probably. Then you have a kind of good feel. 3-4 years down the road, you can really see how you did. But I try to go back every year and just see, why were the teams thinking this way and why was I thinking a different way.
This year you have linebacker Isaiah Simmons, number 1 on your list. What do you like most about him?
Well, Phil, I think he's going to be a safety, honestly. I think he's a safety, but I thought he was the best combination of future potential, production in college, athleticism, football IQ. Honestly, a quarterback's always going to have a different level of football IQ than a lot of players, but I personally saw video of him lining up at 5 different positions. To have that kind of football IQ is extremely rare. Now, will he be taken there? No, he could be taken 9th, He could be down in there, 9, 10, 11 for some teams. But the top 100 is ranking the players. I don't really give certain positions more credit than others. I rank the football players and what I think their potential is, and I think he's spectacular.
Did you find this year, Leggy, that there wasn't as much consensus on guys just because the lack of pro days and everything?
Phil, I would say Most years, I think the average fan would be stunned at how much difference there is on boards from team to team, or even how much difference there is on players from scout to scout. I honestly think that would be a shock for most people if they were privy to that, because it's amazing to me how big the differences are when you talk scout to scout, player to, team to team, just how different the boards are and the reasons there are for people moving, guys up and down. Uh, you know, there are tons of sort of safe players in every draft that every team likes, but the board construction overall, there is a big difference between teams. And I think this year, you'll see more players taken in the third, fourth, and fifth round, where people say, "Oh, I didn't expect that," and I think that's where the lack of pro days and those types of things will kick in. I think the first two rounds are pretty consistent. I think teams have the same 45 to 50 players in those first two rounds.
And of course, you go back and look at your list of top 100. How many do you normally get?
I always feel like if you get more than 80, you've done a good job. That doesn't mean, maybe you should get more guys you think are good players that teams didn't. That I count those too later on. There have been some guys who weren't taken in the top 100 that I had there that deserve to be. And the other is true too. There have been some guys I've had in the top 100 that weren't taken till the sixth round, and it turned out to be the right call. So, but I think if you get more than 80, you've done a lot of work, and the board fell that way. You really can't tell how the board's going to go once it gets rolling. That from the middle of the third round down, you're going to see there's always a divergent. You can always see it from about pick 75. Then suddenly you get a lot more of I didn't see that coming, or I didn't know that guy was, you start seeing that a little more.
Can you give us the name of a player maybe this year who surprised you, might be a first round pick that a lot of people haven't heard about?
Not in the first round. I am interested to see the corners. I think a lot of those guys could sneak into the first round. Anecdotally, I would say the big corners, 6 feet, 6'1", nobody rises faster on draft day than those guys. When the big corners start coming off the board, those are the guys that sneak in. So like a guy like Clemson's, A.J. Terrell, does he sneak into the first round? Some teams have a first-round grade on them. Some teams don't. But the big corners, watch those guys on draft day, because then most teams have about 23, 24 legitimate first-round grades. That's why you see the teams at the back end of the first round either try to get out or they trade back in to pick that one guy who's still on the board that they have a first-round grade on. I think a quarterback will go late in the round because somebody's going to want to get back in there to get him.
What about the wide receiver position? Have you ever seen a class this deep?
Never. You're going to have guys deep into the second day who probably have second-round grades. You're going to have a guy in the deep in the third round, even into the third day, into the fourth round. You'll have guys with second-round grades, and that may make some teams more patient. Taking that position. Fans may say, go get that wide receiver, but if the team has a bunch of guys clustered with the same grade, there's no reason to jump at them if you're getting the same graded player. Now, if you like one guy more than, and there's a big gap there, then you go get him. But I think the Broncos will be presented with a good receiver if all 4 tackles have been taken by about pick 12 or so.
I was going to turn this toward the Broncos now. What do you feel like the team's biggest need is?
Well, Phil, we've discussed. You don't draft for need, Phil.
I know
that. Best player available. No, but actually, this year any pick you have on the board, a receiver will be among the best player available. That will just be a fact, for all of their picks. So, look, Phil, Emmanuel Sanders finished second among the wide receivers in catches for the Broncos this past year, and he didn't play for them after October. So I would say that's a need. I would say they got to look at tackle. I would say you got to look at center, a center guard, a linebacker perhaps, and corners. I think they need at least one more corner, possibly two, just to get the depth where you want it. Look at the division they play in. People are going to be throwing the ball, and they need more depth at corner. I think that got them a little bit last year, and I think those positions. But I think wide receiver, corner, a tackle, developmental tackle, or a guy who can play, and then an interior lineman.
You mentioned you've been covering the draft for 3+ decades. This seems like it's going to be a historic draft, everybody in isolation. What do you expect come Thursday? Do you think this thing's going to go off smoothly?
Well, I think technology will have an impact at some point. I think they will have to stop the clock, probably at times, because something has, they've given teams that option, or it's a possibility. Now, first time in history, you're going to be able to stop the clock when you're on the clock. So I think that will happen. I think we will see it. There will be an inevitable. We've all experienced it now. The league comes to the rest of the world now. Hey, what's wrong with my internet? And so I think that will happen. But in general, I think it's been more has been made of the preparation impact than there really is. Back in the day, they didn't have as many face-to-face meetings with the GM. The area scout met face-to-face with the players, but the GM and the other guys didn't get everybody on the board because it was impossible. So this is kind of an old school draft, and the teams with the good scouting staffs who set their board and stick to their board. I always say teams don't make football mistakes; they make coworker mistakes. They know what they see from the football, but is it the player who has the desire to be better, to work harder, to show up on time? All the things in the workplace the rest of us deal with all the time. That's what determines. You start with talent, but it's the guys who do something with the talent who make your team better, and that's where you got to get it right. And that's the area scout. That's all the work. The guys are already on next year's draft. The area scouts, they've already moved on. They're into the spring group now. So it's those guys. Did they do a good job figuring out who showed up to the strength coaches on time, who handled their classwork or whatever else they had going with, handled it well? Those are the types of things you need. And the teams that did that process well will do well in this draft.
And you've seen the Broncos do that in the previous couple of classes, taking a lot of team captains, that kind of thing. So,
I think you could see, Phil, when things haven't worked in some of the classes in recent years, it was usually they took more than one or two injury gambles in the class, or they had a lot of one-year players. Now, to me, you can take one or two of those guys in your draft class, but you can't really stack them. So, those have to be the outliers instead of the bulk of the class. And, they obviously do this for a living. So, they're not always going to think I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, but maybe not just going off of athleticism or the stopwatch, huh?
Well, you can. You got to have a baseline of talent. There's a certain level of, you can say, well, I want play speed or, whatever, but there is a certain baseline for survival in the NFL. And to me, you start there and then you factor in everything else. You determine at every position what your baseline is. What's the shortest guy you want, the tallest guy, slowest, fastest. Get those parameters and then find all the other stuff in the middle of that.
The Broncos have 5 picks in the top 100 this year. After looking through all that talent, do you expect that they'll use all those?
To me, you always use your picks. I don't think drafting more players is ever a bad thing. I don't think teams do well over the long haul by ditching picks. To me, the whole basis of your operation is your roster. So to me, you take as many players in those spots as you can, especially in the prime real estate of the first 2 days. I don't have all the data, but teams that win the first 2 days of the draft are usually pretty good over the long haul. That's the good real estate. That's why, to me, trading down in the first round, unless you don't have any players left on your board graded in those spots, there's no reason to trade down away from the better players. You already ranked the players. Why would you trade down away from the better ones?
Leggy, last question for you here. You mentioned that this is sort of an old school kind of draft. With the offseason program the way that it is now, and maybe a lack of a training camp coming up, you feel like this season, if there is a season, could have an old school feel to it where guys went away and worked a different job and then came back and played football?
It used to be, when I first started covering the league, guys had summer jobs. Mini camp was 2 days in June. That was it. That was the entire offseason program. So I honestly, Phil, I do think it will take some thought on Lauren Landau, the strength conditioning coach. It will take some long-term thinking on his part to do. What do you do with guys who've been working out on their own and each doing probably a little different program? They're going to have to think that through. And if there is some kind of training camp, and we all hope there is, but if there is, I think you'll see sort of that soft tissue injury issue, hamstrings and calf injuries and things like that. It will be something teams are eventually going to have to think about. And honestly, I hope we're all thinking about it, because that will mean it's underway and going. But, as Von Miller said, I think everybody wants everybody to be safe and then get the football back.
Exactly. Leggy, thank you so much for taking some time to join us, and stay safe.
You too. Thanks, Phil.